So this is part 2 of a continuation of a talk on the innovation revolution. The innovation revolution, in summarizing the first talk, basically is to bring about a new paradigm where we change success equals money plus the right team to the right market conditions to success equals validated idea. So how do we do that? Okay, how do we bring about this paradigm? Well, it's through the open startup. An open startup is a startup anyone can join. Anyone can join. The current startup model is closed, meaning if you see a startup, if someone's talking about a startup, you can't join that startup, right? You can't be part of it. And ultimately, only individuals who are part of a closed network can. So the first thing that we need to do is create a collaborative form of the startup, and that is the open startup. We need to break down the institutional startup, right? The closed institutional startup, and turn it into the collaborative open startup. Now, the only way to do this is via framework, and that framework is the Open Startup Wiki. The Open Startup Wiki is a platform that is powered by the Open Startup Engine. Now, I'm simplifying the terms. There's actually a more precise name for the Open Startup Engine. It's called the Open Incubator Framework. It's a framework that I spent the last 2 years developing. And the framework is based on 16 years of me struggling doing startups. And to be honest with you, failing. Now, Eric Ries uses the nice term called lessons learned. Lessons learned means failing, right? So whenever you hear someone says, oh, I've got 10 years of lessons learned doing startups, what they really mean is I've got 10 years of failing. No one likes to say the word failing, but they've got to have it come to Jesus. Lessons learned means failing, right? You only learn through your failures. That's a very known axiom, right? We learn from our failures, not our successes. Failure is very important. Failure is what enables us to create new paradigms. Failure is what has allowed me to develop OIF, the Open Incubator Framework, or in simple terms, think of it as the Open Startup Engine. So the Open Startup Engine, basically, what it does is it removes the 3 bottlenecks that I will talk about, and ultimately, the moment that an idea is validated, and OIF validates, think of the validation component of OIF, we call the noodle, right? The validation, the noodle. And if you know anything, you'll know something called your noodle, right? So the idea of OIF in a way was inspired by what they're doing, but taking it to the next logical step, the noodle. The noodle is think of it as the Google algorithm, right? It is a method of validating that actually will validate ideas. It's either going to validate or it's not. If it doesn't validate, you put another idea. Or validation may take time. Example, right? Paradigms, I'll give an example, and I've talked about this. For example, I don't know if you know, but the steam engine was invented in the 1400s. Now, it didn't come about until the 1700s, late 1700s, whenever the Industrial Revolution started. I think it was late 1700s, right? Ultimately, the reason why is the market conditions. So imagine if you have an idea, but the market's not quite ready, the paradigm's not ready, and it can sit. That idea can sit, and it will slowly validate. There's no time limits. You put an idea up on the Open Startup Wiki, and anyone could use the wiki. It's going to be in as many languages as Wikipedia, and ultimately, the way I've designed it and built it is simpler than Wikipedia. If you think Wikipedia is simple, what I have done is much simpler. Okay, so the key part is validation. Once it validates, what's going to happen is it automatically starts removing the talent bottleneck. Because remember, what is the open startup? It's a startup anyone can join. So ultimately, the validation engine will actually do 2 things. One is it removes the talent bottleneck, and also it starts to remove the funding bottleneck. Right now, funding is, if you have a startup and you're trying to get funding, you are a chicken with your head cut off. Literally, you're running around like a chicken with your head cut off. And ultimately, everyone is banging at people's doors, asking. There's too much. People can't do the due diligence, qualify the ideas, because there's no validation engine for these ideas. They're just doing it on the merits of paper. They're doing it on the merits of, what I call closed institutional framework. And ultimately, closed institutional frameworks have very specific criteria for validating, right? Institutions are looking for a certain caliber of individual. They're looking for a specific type of person. And ultimately, these people are, for the most part, individuals that have come from big business. So if you look at like Dave McClure, where does he come from? PayPal. You look at pretty much every significant VC or the new breed of VCs. All of them have come from some success. They've taken their money and then now putting their investments back into making more money. It's what I call a closed institutional framework with startup. So the thing that the Open Startup Wiki will do is, one, simplify it, and by removing the bottlenecks. Now, the other thing too is currently funding is you're begging for it. Something called micro-seed crowdfunding is going to change this. It's going to allow you to raise money from the crowd. But the problem with crowdfunding, if you know crowdfunding, 95% of crowdfunding fails. The systemic process of crowdfunding is inherently flawed. It doesn't work for startups. And ultimately, what I'm doing is adding a tried and tested funding engine that's raised $1.6 billion for strategic initiatives, modifying it with crowdfunding and creating a completely new crowdfunding engine through OIF, right? We're not just crowdfunding, which I call passive crowdfunding. So the moment an idea validates, not only that, it starts raising money. Okay? Number 3. The next thing is developing. The developing bottleneck, as I've mentioned before, has everything to do with forming a corporation, to securing and developing the IP and everything else, to developing the prototype, and so on. There's a lot to developing. And ultimately, the problem right now is when you can hire a PHP developer for less than $10 an hour, the only value item is the idea. And the moment you put your idea up in the public domain, right, and say, hey, this is what I want to do, whether it's on AngelList or anything else, what you're doing is you're saying, hey, take my idea, steal it, incorporate, use it. And if you don't believe me, ideas are important, just do Google, quotes ideas. You will find that every significant innovator in the world has said ideas is the most valuable thing. Now, VCs, investors, other, seed investors, basically don't want you to value your idea. They want you to put the idea up there because ultimately they want access to it. Now, IP is extremely important, not only for raising money, but for securing and everything else. And right now, there's a massive war going on that's not public. It's a private war. It's a secret war. Google, Microsoft, Apple, they're buying up patents everywhere they can and ultimately trying to, control. There's a company called Intellectual Ventures, IV, Intellectual Ventures, and these guys are just running around buying up patents. So they, if you own the patent, you control the market. And a case in point, there was a great startup called Modista. Modista could have been the next Google. They had a very innovative idea for shopping, and you can actually check out the talks or my videos, and also read the blog on that the guy wrote. And basically, they got their startup shut down because another company, which had $45 million in investment, a bigger fish, basically filed patent infringements on them, when in fact there was no patent infringements. And you can read the document, you can see the patents and everything else. But the thing is, if someone plays this dirty trick on you, it's going to cost you $1 million to fight it. If you're just getting going, and in their case they had $600,000 in place, these guys basically didn't see it as a winning battle. They're going up against bigger fish who have more money and everything else, and ultimately it was pointless to fight. So there was a case of using IP to basically kill innovation. And there's hundreds, this was a lucky case to have this out there, because stuff like this doesn't get out there. I've had my ideas validated by Google, YouTube. I had the first playlist. I had the first streaming videos for YouTube videos before YouTube. Wikipedia launched in late 2009 as a prototype, and all this stuff didn't come in and play until 2010. And they even launched something called YouTube Lean Back, which is a direct ripoff of YouTube, of Wikitube. And they've modified it because I made a big splash about it. I made a lot of, there's a lot of documentation me saying that, and they've modified it so much now that it doesn't look the same. The cross-bottom playlist that YouTube is using, where does that come from? Well, it comes from Wikitube. So ultimately, my idea of Wikitube validated, and I call validated is my nice way of saying robbed, stolen, right? For YouTube. So when that happened to me, is a moment I pivoted and said, you know what? The problem is the startup, and how can we solve it? So what I want to do is transform the closed startup into an open one, and I want to transform the closed funding networks into an open one, and bring about the innovation needed. Because ultimately what we're trying to do is actually dealing with a much bigger problem, which is we're hitting a wall in the next 30 years. This is a wall that was documented in 1971, and we have been following the charts that they predicted, and we are right on track. Actually, it's actually gone faster than what they predicted. So you can watch the talks on that, and I think I've linked them on the other video, but definitely watch these talks. There's a TEDx talk that's based on it, which is probably the most important TED talk. And if I annotate this, I'll put it right here. And ultimately, what we're trying to do is overcome a bigger problem. And that simple fact is, we will not be able to maintain our current standard given the current framework, and we have to bring about a new paradigm. So the fundamental way to bring about a new paradigm is by fixing the problem. Now, my position is this, is that the closed institutional startup launches closed institutional corporations, right, that benefit a few lesser stakeholders. Open, collaborative startups launch open, collaborative corporations that anyone can join that are selfless, not selfish. So I hope this talk is going to help you start thinking about this paradigm. I can show you the soft proto of what we're building. We're currently coding it. We're actually thinking about open sourcing it. Talking to our leadership team. I want to bring this around in a massive way, and open source would be a great way to do that. So if you're an open source developer, if you're interested in this, then let's talk and figure out how we can do this. Thanks.